Hi, I'm Brett from papercartridges.com, and today we're talking about something a little bit outside of my usual content, but there's still an old black powder rifle at the middle of everything we're going to discuss today. I'm here in the final weeks of my deployment, still in Kuwait deployment, but obviously I can't shoot black powder here, and I've pretty much run out of video that I can use of me shooting stuff before I left. So that's why we've been doing these nerdy deep dives of just stuff that I enjoy talking about. So the nerdy deep dive today is unpacking a bit of a loaded question. And the question is, does the U.S. Army's current day leadership doctrine come from 150-year-old concepts and tactics that the Prussians developed for use with the Dreyse Zündnadelgewehr, so the famous Dreyse Needle Rifle? And the answer to that is it depends on who you ask, because the Prusso-German heritage, the supposed Prusso-German heritage behind the Army's current doctrine for what we call mission command is a pretty controversial and contentious subject. Mission command at large in the Army is a bit of a contentious subject, which the Army has frankly been struggling with to implement, to be honest. But we can probably all agree on a couple things. And the first is, right now in 2024, the United States Army's approach to command and control is something called mission command. And the second thing we can probably all agree on is that in the 19th century, the Prussian army developed new tactical concepts that they customized around the advantages of the Dreyse Zündnadelgewehr, and these concepts eventually evolved over the 19th and early 20th centuries to look something really similar to the principles of mission command that the U.S. Army uses today. In fact, they look so similar that the Army doctrine today for mission command at ADP 6-0 straight out says the root of mission command goes back to the Prussians. The doctrine writers actually name drop Helmut von Moltke and some others, and they mentioned that these new concepts were first practically applied during the three wars where the Prussians were using the Dreyse Zündnadelgewehr. So the Danish War of 1864, Austro-Prussian War 1866, Franco-Prussian War in 1870. And it's actually a little bit embarrassing that they call the Franco-Prussian War the Franco-Russian War. I assume that's a typo. Then they also get the year wrong for the Battle of Jena, which should be 1806, not 1809. So doctrine writers not off to a very great start. And I should mention now, by the way, that these are my opinions. These are definitely not not anywhere near probably the actual position of the United States government or the Army. You're getting Brett's opinion. But at this point, you might be wondering, what the heck is mission command and whatever it is you call the thing that the Prussians were doing in the 19th century. So it makes sense to start with Prussia, so the happy land of my ancestors. A small country surrounded by large empires and potentially very large rivals. Prussia gets their butts kicked by Napoleon. Voltaire mocked Prussia, called it a kingdom of border strips. It has sandy soil, makes for poor crops, lousy pine forests, not much industry. And then they even have another wake-up call in 1850 at the punctation of Olmütz, where Prussia couldn't mobilize their army in time and Austria forced them to sign an embarrassing treaty. Bismarck called that the humiliation of Olmütz. But out of all these crises, we get two overarching main things. We see the rise of the Prussian Great General Staff, and their only job in life is to plan, and then they're empowered to direct future mobilizations in the next war. The second thing we see is an obsessive conviction in Prussia that the only way we're going to win a war against one of our bigger enemies is by moving faster than they can and delivering a knockout blow before the enemy can mobilize their bigger army. So the general staff is planning for this future war where we only have one shot to win. Prussia has to mobilize faster, call up the reserves, raise the wartime army faster than our enemies, move that army with speed, and then win a decisive battle very early in the war. Later on, came to be known as the Kesselschlacht doctrine. We'll see that in the First World War especially. But all of that's at the strategic level, the big picture level. Down at the soldier on the battlefield level into the 19th century, tactics are based around the smoothbore musket, around the bayonet. So think of Napoleon, Jomini. Infantry move in tight formations, in lines and columns. Soldiers stand shoulder to shoulder. The officers are right there with them. The colonel of the regiment is there, and he could probably shout an order, and most, if not all, of his troops could hear him. They're that close. They're that tightly packed together. And then you would see the general up on a hill or some vantage point nearby watching the whole battle. The battles, the armies of this era are small enough the general Napoleon could direct them hands-on, piece by piece. So he's standing there and giving orders, send in Marshal Soult, hands-on, actively directing the battle. And this system works great, by the way. It maximizes the firepower of the smoothbore musket. Command and control is fairly simple and direct, and everyone is having a great time and everyone's happy until Claude Minier shows up and ruins everything when the rifle musket appears in the mid-1850s, early 1860s. And now suddenly every infantry grunt has a weapon that in theory has 6 times the effective range of the old smoothbore musket. And now all the armies and generals in Europe are realizing if we keep our soldiers packed together, shoulder to shoulder, that's probably not going to be the best tactical formation to use when all of our enemies have these new accurate long-range rifles. They're just going to shoot these formations to shreds from long range. And this is the conundrum, that if we spread everyone out, if we go to kind of more of a thin, extended order so that we're not a big, dense, tight mass target for rifles, there goes our command and control. The colonel can shout an order, but if we're all spread out, only a small fraction of the unit is actually going to hear that order. And to make matters worse, if you spread your units out, there goes your firepower, because with muzzle loaders, you have to pack a bunch of soldiers together to generate the sort of decisive firepower you need to be effective. If you spread it out, it's going to be diluted so much, there goes your firepower. And it's starting to sound like future war is going to be some kind of uncontrolled anarchy where the generals and officers can't control their troops. Officers are getting picked off from long range. For instance, General Napier, who was the hero of the British at the Peninsula Campaign, he even said in the 1850s, rifles should be abolished because they've thrown such a monkey wrench into the works. But the genie can't go back into the lamp. So the paradigm has been changed. Some nerd wrote a great book about that called The Destroying Angel. It's on Amazon. But the armies in this era, they have to adapt. And so they have to find a way to keep order and control on the battlefield, which is getting bigger, many more troops, industries putting more men on the battlefield. So one approach to keeping order and control on the battlefield is to simply do everything according to the grand plan.
How else do you think the battles are directed?
Our battles are directed, sir.
Well, of course they are, Blackadder, directed according to the grand plan.
And like General Melchett said, basically the generals, the officers, the staff go off and they come up with a cunning plan, a written order, meticulously planned out, very control-oriented, very top-down. But it's one way you can preserve order, command, and control on the modern battlefield where the size of armies, the physical size of battlefields, the theaters of operations are getting huge with industry and railroad. So this is reaching a point within only 10-15 years where the sheer scope of operations is beyond anything Napoleon could have imagined. So Napoleon's army, he could move 15, maybe 20 kilometers a day. Now with railroads, you can move armies hundreds of kilometers a day, potentially. So the command and control approach, you can emphasize the plan, and the worst thing you can possibly do is deviate from that plan, because then you will unsynchronize the works for everyone else. Everyone else is counting on you to be where you're supposed to be according to the plan. So if you go off and do your own thing, you disrupt the entire scheme of maneuver, scheme of operations. And the absolutely worst thing you can do is go off on your own and use your initiative to capture Aqaba without orders.
Who told you to take Aqaba?
Nobody.
Sir.
Sir.
You acted without orders, you know.
Shouldn't officers use their initiative at all times?
Not really. It's awfully dangerous, Lawrence.
Yes, I know.
Lawrence of Arabia really is a great movie for teaching leadership concepts, and I may or may not have forced my soldiers to watch the first half, not the whole thing, not too long ago. But the Prussians also have to deal with these paradigm shifts. How do we keep military control on this spread out future battlefield? And in this era, Helmut von Moltke the Elder is the chief of the Prussian General Staff. And if you've never heard of him before, you probably have heard his most famous quote, which is, "Plans don't survive first contact with the enemy," or something to that effect. Plans are great until the bullets start flying, and Moltke realizes that plans can also tend to be slow, and Prussia can't have that. Prussia has to win fast, move fast. But going into the 1860s, the Prussians have some key advantages, 3 of them, I would say. The first is that after reforms of the 1850s and 1860s, Prussia has professionalized their military. It's not perfect. Their officers are the Prussian Junker nobility. There's plenty to criticize from the Prussian army of this era. We have to be careful not to idolize them or make a caricature out of them. But they really have built a professional army, compared especially to their peers. Their officer corps in particular. They also are one of the few militaries in this era conducting full-scale, huge exercises out in the field. Other armies, their aristocratic officers, oh, good heavens, that sounds ghastly, actually go out in the field. The most other armies would do, like the Austrians, they would have big parades in the capital on the parade ground, but they would not do the full-scale exercises that the Prussians were doing. And second, the Prussian officers in the 1860s had developed a professional culture that valued independent thinking and initiative taking. We can see this going back to Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, after the disaster of 1806, 1807 at Jena-Auerstadt. The Prussians build on this concept. There's a new drill regulation in 1847, which was described in 1862 by a Prussian officer. Its character is not described in dead forms or mechanical nature, but fresh, living principles are its characteristics. It therefore sets out principles and grasps the circumstances from a universal standpoint, but leaves the attainment of the result to the intelligence of the individual with free scope. The regulation does not provide specific recipes into which the mind is forced. Rather, it asks for the correct assessment of each particular situation and leads to the guiding principles of the development of the thinking military on the right track. Therefore, it does not need to be learned, nor viewed in its formal part as an elixir for everything, but to be understood and intelligently applied. So instead of a grand plan, instead of a step-by-step recipe for what to do, the Prussian officers have some room inside the guidelines to decide the best way to handle things based on the situation in front of them, based on the scope of the situation. And the German officer who described the regulations, the word for scope he uses is Spielraum, which is the same German word to describe windage in a rifle barrel. So think of like wiggle room, room for play. This is what the Prussian officers have within these guidelines. And the third advantage that Prussia has, and you were waiting for this, Prussia is the only army in Europe with a breech-loading rifle. So Prussia has the Dreyse Zündnadelgewehr, and we've covered this rifle in several videos. In fact, I think this might be the 4th video in a row that kind of features the Dreyse Zündnadelgewehr in some way. But if you know nothing else about this rifle, it has 3 or 4 times the rate of fire compared to a muzzleloader. And so a company with muzzle loaders typically forms up in 2 or 3 ranks to generate enough firepower. But the Dreyse Zündnadelgewehr can generate the same amount of firepower with about 1 platoon deployed in 1 rank. So 1 platoon of Prussians in extended order, same firepower as a company with muzzle loaders in closed order. But there's a catch to this, because the Dreyse shoots fast, but it is not particularly accurate at long range. The slower firing rifle muskets are much more accurate at distance. So that means for the Prussian fire to be effective, the Prussians have to get in close, within a couple hundred meters, where the Dreyse fire really turns devastatingly effective. When you combine all of these things, so you have the professional army, it already has this tradition and culture for independent action. They have the Dreyse Zündnadelgewehr. All of these things combined can unlock some pretty incredible new tactical opportunities. And Moltke is often called the father of these new type of tactics and leadership methods that these new tactics require. So his first year as chief of the General Staff in 1858, he's already writing about the need for the independence of subordinate commanders, the need for them to make quick decisions. And we see Moltke's new ideas clearly laid out in an order for large unit maneuvers in 1861. The Prussians are fighting in small detachments. They're using rifle squads. Soldiers are encouraged to go prone, take cover, and to take the fight deep, push into the enemy formations. We can do that because of the firepower of the Dreyse Zündnadelgewehr. Even if the Prussians don't have the numerical superiority, with a smaller force, they can still hold an enemy force in the front and have enough troops to maneuver around on the side and pour fire in on the flank. So the 1861 order gives 3 broad directives to Prussian commanders. The first is engage the enemy in a firefight and hold him there, and engage the enemy in the open on level ground if possible. And third, most importantly, fight deep, which means to push in around the enemy's flanks, in between his formations, but always be ready if the situation requires to fall back and reform the more traditional solid front line if we have to. Now before this time, before about 1861 in the Prussian army, the battalion was the main tactical unit, which is led by a major. But if we're now fighting deep, if we're really moving in fast, we're trying to get really close, we have to get within a couple hundred meters of the enemy quickly where the Dreyse Needle Rifle is effective. The battalion is just too big and unwieldy. We have to break it up. So Moltke starts gradually making the company a more independent tactical unit. When advancing, the Prussian companies formed little columns which can move very quickly. They're fairly small, but then when they get close enough, they deploy into a firing line. And we see fire controlled at the platoon level, even at the half platoon level, by section, firing kleinen Salve, so these famous Prussian small volleys. And in the 1861 orders, this is just profoundly important. Battalion commanders are told to give some independence to their companies. Don't give orders that are too strict. And again, remember, this is coming in 1861. If the colonel or the major give orders that are too strict or too rigid, you lose the independence of the individual companies. But the higher command cannot exercise direct control over all these little company columns moving all at once. So if you don't give them independence, you try to control them, that's when you end up with the unmanageable mass, the chaos and anarchy. So the Prussian system is in the reverse. If you try to have too much direct control, that results in chaos. You have to give some independence to the captains of these companies to figure things out on their own without direct control. And in the Prussian texts, we encounter the same German word over and over again. And I'm probably going to butcher this German word, but it's Selbsttätigkeit. So it is literally self-operating, self-acting. It can mean independence, a form of autonomy. And in the context of the Prussian officers, these company commanders, It means that they're given fairly broad orders from higher, and that they have to take some initiative. They have to use their own discretion, make decisions on their own about what they're going to do based on the situation that they see in front of them, even without any new orders coming from their colonel or major. And this is really illustrated well in a great painting of the Battle of Königgrätz by Karl Röchling. I think it's from 1891. But by Königgrätz, by 1866, the Prussians have had several years to adopt these new tactics and kind of incorporate them into their culture. So here we see Prussians firing at the Austrians, a very famous painting. It looks like we're in the aftermath of an Austrian assault that has been stopped, but there's another one that looks to be forming up, getting ready to approach in the background. But notice the Prussian formation here. They are not in a straight line. They are not on a solid front. They're formed up basically in one rank. But if you look at this formation shape, they're in like a V-shaped formation, and they're firing in two directions. So the Prussian infantry here are fighting deeply. They have fixed the enemy in front, and now they're firing into their flank, even though they're probably outnumbered here on this portion of battlefield. We got the captain on his horse here. He's fighting his company in two directions. He's maybe a little overextended, but he's probably willing to take this risk to push in deeply because he is expecting the other Prussian captains, which he knows them in his battalion, in his regiment. He absolutely trusts them. He knows they're going to see what's going on. They'll show up, assess the situation, make a decision, and come support, all without needing any further orders from the battalion or from higher. So we can actually see that, or it could be that in this painting, where it looks like there's another Prussian company here in the background that has just arrived. They probably heard all the Schnellfeuer from these Zündnadelgewehrs, and so that captain of this other company, he moves to the sound of the guns, he sees the situation, he sees an opportunity to move on the flank of the Austrians and pour in his own Schnellfeuer. So for the poor Austrians on the receiving end of this, it's got to be just overwhelming. It would seem like the Prussians are everywhere. They're moving so fast, they're moving in so quickly, and then they deploy into extended line and they pour in so much firepower, and they just shoot the Austrians to ribbons. And at the tactical level, this worked very, very well. It was incredibly effective. And the firepower of the Dreyse Zündnadelgewehr enables this agility, the flexibility of small units to act with this considerable independence. So from this concept, from these tactics that originally were built around the Dreyse Zündnadelgewehr, the Prussians and then the Germans after unification, they went even further. They were building this new style of leadership that empowered subordinate commanders to make rapid decisions. And remember that this is all being done because the Prussians need speed. They've got one shot to win the war, so they have to move fast, take that one swing, and just land that knockout blow before the enemy can mobilize their superior strength and numbers. So during operations, when the unexpected happens, when the situation suddenly changes, there is no time to request new orders. There's no time to modify a plan, wait for a colonel or a general to decide what to do. The subordinate commander has to know what the general or colonel wants to do, and they have to work towards that goal even as the situation is changing, because anything else is just going to take too long. And there's a story supposedly from the Austro-Prussian War, so 1866, that illustrates this concept. I think it's probably apocryphal, but whether or not it actually happened doesn't really matter, because the Prussians believed it did, and they used it in their instruction for junior officers. So we have Prince Friedrich Karl, who commands the First Army during the Austro-Prussian War. And as the story goes, he has a major on his staff, and he gives a task to this major, something like take a couple battalions and hold this position in my rear so that we don't get surprised by a flank attack. And then the prince takes the main army and moves up down the road. And a couple hours later, the major's sitting here with his battalions, and he hears further down the road the sound of a major battle, the artillery fire of a major battle. And then maybe 30, 45 minutes later, a large number of the routed, shattered, destroyed elements of the enemy come retreating in front of the position that the major has been told to hold. And the major is thinking, I've been ordered to hold this position, I'm going to hold it. And the retreating enemy mob passes in front of him and they escape. So the prince comes galloping over to where the major was, and he was expecting to find the major there with a whole bunch of prisoners. And so he says, why on earth didn't you stop the enemy from retreating right in front of you? They were really easy to bag, these prisoners. Now they got away, they're going to regroup, they're going to reorganize, and we're going to have to fight them again. And the major, he thinks he's smart, as we like to think, he comes up with a real clever answer, and he clicks his heels and he says, Your Highness, your authority comes from the king. So anything that you order me to do, it is as though the king himself ordered me to do it, and I would never disobey a clear, direct order from the king. And that's why I obeyed the order to the letter. And the prince very famously snaps right back at this major, and he says, the king made you a major and a staff officer so that you would know when not to obey his orders. And this story sums up the extent of the Prussian concept, that these officers are expected to be Selbsttätigkeit, independent acting, take risks, move fast, but in addition, they have to do more than that. They have to exert even more energy towards seizing opportunities. So this major was supposed to know that more than just being independent acting, he was supposed to know that from the time the prince gave the original order to when the enemy was retreating in front of him, the situation had changed. There had been a big battle up the road. The enemy had been defeated, so it's unlikely that this flank attack is going to be coming. So the order that the prince gave him is really no longer relevant. And now here is a chance to bag a whole bunch of prisoners. And if the major would have gone and rounded them up and they couldn't escape and regroup and fight again, the next battle would be easier for Prussia, and Prussia would come closer to winning the war. But instead, he didn't do any of that, and this golden opportunity just sailed right by. And in any other army, nobody could really blame the major, because he could say, I followed my orders precisely, and he did. He did exactly what he was ordered to do. He could say, I did my job, I followed the plan, I did my bit for king and country. I was ready here to stop that flank attack if it ever came. But in the Prussian army, he failed. You failed your duty as a trusted staff officer if you don't realize that the situation had changed, and it's your job, it's your duty to seize that opportunity, even if it means disobeying an order that had just been given to you before, or even if it's taking a little bit of a risk. And this system of command and control that we see develop in Prussia requires senior leaders to trust their subordinates, which requires extremely competent subordinates, highly, highly professional. So basically the sort of people that you can actually trust to go use their initiative, to make their own decisions and take risks, to act without orders, or even to disobey orders. The Prussian mantra was doing something is always better than doing nothing. Clausewitz would say, timidity and indecision are worse than being audacious. And the Prussians never actually gave this concept that they came up with a name. They never summed it all up in one term. The closest they came was describing the Selbsttätigkeit of these subordinate commanders. The Prussian version of this was kind of primitive, very embryonic during 1866. It is developed further. Moltke writes some very clear orders to large unit commanders that has this philosophy in it before the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. But it's still not formally defined. We see it in Moltke's essays, we see it in the instructions to unit commanders. It was how the Prussians were operating, but it didn't have a name. It's not until later in the 19th century, so after German unification, when this concept gets developed even further. So 1880s, early 1890s, we see it given a name, and if you know anything about this subject, you've probably been waiting for me to use this word, Auftragstaktik. So in English, we would translate this often as mission tactics or task-focused tactics. But originally, I don't really like the term Auftragstaktik. It was coined as a disparaging term by the critics of Auftragstaktik, by those who favored Normaltaktik, so General von Scherff, General von Boguslavski. They opposed this concept, argued against it, but they came up with the name in the last years of the 19th century. But they can't stop it, and so the system is formally adopted into the German army in the late 1880s, about the time that Moltke, at 88 years old, he retires from the Prussian General Staff in 1888. And even then, the word Auftragstaktik is not used in the German doctrine. It's more a term of convenience to describe this concept. And Germany, of course, unifies in 1871. It then becomes the dominant Central European power. It has the largest economy in continental Europe. It is the preeminent military power of continental Europe. It starts to become a global empire in this era. In the 20th century, they start to build a powerful, world-class blue water navy. But this is Brett's opinion now. I think the German army in the 20th century never got the paranoia of those dead Prussians out of their heads, which was wars have to be short. We must mobilize fast. We must attack before the enemy's ready. We have to deliver that crushing, war-winning blow early. And this is why German logistics in both world wars were very anemic, because they didn't plan for the war to go on very long. So all the money and all the planning and all the focus went to the best possible combat forces we can have, and logistics was something of an afterthought. The German army had a fairly short operational reach because they weren't planning on operating for very long. Sometimes we hear of the tooth to tail ratio in an army, so the ratio of combat forces to logistics. And so the German army had a lot of really big teeth and a teeny little logistical tail. And in both world wars, due to a failure of strategy, the German army ended up in exactly the same sort of attrition war, production war, logistics-heavy wars that all the dead Prussians knew that Germany couldn't win, or at least Prussia couldn't win, and had warned about and planned feverishly so that they wouldn't have to fight that war. In the German military, we see the supplies being hauled by horses and wagons well into the 1940s. So we like to think newsreels, Rommel, tanks, Kubelwagens, half-tracks, all that was up front with the combat troops. The logistics was anemic and far behind. They had spent their money, they had focused their attention on the tactical combat power, because the war's not going to last long enough to require these robust logistics. So how do we get from 1945, der Untergang, to the U.S. Army in 2024 officially adopting mission command as our approach to command and control? The U.S. Army in the 19th century looked nothing like the Prussian army. It was tiny. You could almost say that there was no American army. Of course, we had one, but it was tiny. It was smaller than the army of the Dukedom of Mecklenburg in the 19th century. And American officers in this tiny army did often act independently, this was not so much out of any conscious leadership, culture, doctrine, but more because they're in remote locations strung out all over a continent-sized frontier. In Prussia, on the other hand, and then in Germany after unification, every man went into the army, served several years in the standing army. Then he went into the reserves. Then he went into the Landwehr for over 20 years. There's a universal military obligation for every man in Germany, and they're ready to be called up if there's a war. The Prussians and then the Germans have a general staff. There is no general staff in the United States Army. There's a tiny officer corps. In 1861, in 1917, in 1941, we see a pattern that when the war starts, the United States has to raise this war-fighting force from almost scratch. So we have to bring in hundreds of thousands of civilians who have no military experience. They're not in any reserve capacity. They're just Joe from the factory, and then now you're in the army. And it's the same thing with the officers. The officers have no prior military experience. In the Civil War, kind of the famous quote, many a general went into battle with a sword in one hand and Jomini's book, The Art of War, in the other. And these were temporary armies. So we raised the army, we fought the war, and then everyone goes home. And so the army shrunk back again to almost nothing, about the size that it was before the war started. And in wartime, when we did raise these armies, it's very top-down command and control, because do you really expect the sort of self-action, initiative, decision-making from a lieutenant who was a college kid and then went to OCS for 12 weeks, and now he's got a butter bar and he's lost in the woods with his map and compass? You give very simple, direct, rigid orders to an inexperienced army like we had. But then after the Vietnam War ends, so later Cold War era, the draft ends, and suddenly the United States is faced with a situation where we are going to have a smaller army than our adversaries because the draft is over. So with volunteers, with the volunteer army, you need quality over quantity. So in the 1980s, we start to see a attempt at professionalization of the United States Army. And the Army is also looking for a combat multiplier against the much larger numbers of the Eastern Bloc forces that could come pouring through the Fulda Gap. Coincidentally, also at this era, the senior Army leaders had been junior officers in World War II, so they had fought against the Germans, and they had been kind of impressed with the tactical performance of the Germans. So think like General Depew, the first commander of TRADOC, really infatuated with the Germans in World War II. But I had already been in the Army for several years before Mission Command was formally adopted by the Army in 2012. And so today, it is the Army's approach to command and control. Garrison in wartime, by all ranks, everyone is supposed to use this approach to leadership. And the Army, honestly, we are struggling with it. It is not what we are used to. There's a lot of great articles by people much smarter than me, 2-star, 3-star generals, writing these papers asking, why are we struggling so much with mission command? And among the reasons given, risk aversion is a big one. Instant communications. If you want to be a direct controller, if you want to be a micromanager, your life has never been easier because of all the instantaneous communication systems that we have. But there really hasn't been too much emphasis on mission command, to be honest. I'm willing to bet if I walked outside right now and I grabbed the first 5 random lieutenants I could find, I don't think one of them would be able to actually define what is mission command. But the concept has evolved in the U.S. Army. The doctrine got updated in 2019, and there are many similarities to the Prusso-German system, but you definitely don't see the independence of the commander enshrined the way that the Germans did. Subordinates in American Mission Command exercise very disciplined initiative. The doctrine says that leaders are supposed to know when the situation has changed and old orders are no longer relevant, but even in this milder form, the Army is struggling with it. And where Mission Command came from is controversial. There's a funny cartoon series called Doctrine Man, and one of the themes in this cartoon series are the ghosts of dead Prussians coming to haunt the Army's doctrine writers. So did we copy Mission Command from dead Prussians, or did the good idea fairy float down and magically inspire some American generals during the Obama administration? But ADP 6-0 says the roots of Mission Command go back to the Prussians, to Moltke, to the wars of the 1860s. And even that is controversial. There are some very accomplished Army professors and historians who teach at the Staff College. In the last decade or so, they have been saying that there is no Prusso-German inspiration for American Mission Command, and that the Nazis used Auftragstechnik, they were bad, and the Germans were back-to-back World War losers. So the Nazis and the losers have nothing to teach us. The new narrative is that Americans kind of spontaneously came up with Mission Command, and we started using it 200 years ago. And we're smart. We're the back-to-back World War winners, so we should study what we did, not what those loser Germans did. And while I definitely agree that there were occasions in American military history where American officers and soldiers showed some independence, where senior commanders gave subordinates like mission task guidance. There were early regulations, 19th century, early 20th century, where commanders are told not to micromanage their subordinates. This really is a tiny sliver of what is the much larger philosophy and leadership culture that is integral to Mission Command, or whatever you want to call what the Prussians and Germans were doing. So I am nowhere near as accomplished as the professors who are arguing for this, but it strikes me as almost like a politically correct and very American-centric approach, if that makes sense. Now, there is an absurd myth that the U.S. Army's tactics and doctrine are basically just copies of German tactics and doctrine from World War II. And this myth you could say that it does falsely glorify the Third Reich in a way. And it creates the impression World War II Germans were just the best ever at doing war. And I would say that this is false. I think there is some legitimate eagerness to repudiate this myth, but in doing so, it's kind of created a myth of its own that Auftragstaktik is a Third Reich thing, when it's not. Demonstrably not. That these ideas, I think, Selbsttätigkeit, the basis for what would later be called Auftragstaktik as a term of convenience, these ideas were forming 60 or 70 years before the Second World War even starts. So we see it in the 1847 regulations. Moltke's talking about it in the 1850s, the 1861 maneuver order. These were Prussian ideas. And now today, most Western armies have adopted some form of mission command for many of the same reasons that the Prussians did in the first place. So Western countries typically have small, volunteer, professional armies. Adversaries, like think non-NATO outside outside NATO, adversaries typically have much larger forces. So the Western militaries, NATO militaries, need speed and this decentralized decision making, and we need initiative from our officers who are boots on the ground, who have the most up-to-date understanding of a situation in front of them. We need them to be empowered to continue working towards the commander's intent, even if it means deviating from a previous order, because just like the Prussians, we can't afford to lose time and be slow. That yields the initiative and the advantage to the larger, slower adversaries. But I, for my part, my opinion, I don't understand why we just can't say that, yeah, the Prussians, given their unique situation in geography and history, they had the Zündnadelgewehr, their professional culture, Selbsttätigkeit. I don't know why we can't just agree and admit that, yeah, they came up with some of these ideas first. In the U.S. Army, we've given Mission Command a very American twist. We really emphasize the trust and shared understanding principles of it. The Prussians and the Germans much more emphasize the independence of the commander. So the Army is not just rote copying the German system, and I really don't think it is glorifying the Third Reich to simply acknowledge that 160 years ago there were some clanky old Prussians wearing really silly hats who had a crude breech-loading rifle, and they were the first to come up with what turned out to be a really good idea. And personally, I like Mission Command. In my career, I have had 4 company commands, so that's that's over 8 years in company command, and it's amazing that I have any hair left at all after that. Probably not the best for my career. I'm a little bit behind my peers so far as broadening assignments and things, but in my first command, so in 2013 when I took my first command, I had never even heard of Mission Command, which is not surprising because the doctrine was really only a year old at the time. But back then in 2013, everything was strictly top down. This is my impression, you know, a lieutenant at the company level. But my impression, top down, and there's risk aversion everywhere. It's a CYA culture, you know, cover your ass culture. Maybe now things are starting to change. I teach Mission Command to my officers. I teach it to my soldiers, my NCOs. I force them to watch Lawrence of Arabia to talk about leadership examples. But I really don't think I am like glorifying the Third Reich by saying that 160 years ago, as warfare was changing, as paradigms were shifting, and we're entering the modern era, a country that doesn't even exist anymore had some good ideas about leadership. But I think I've rambled on long enough and my voice is starting to go. It's been a long day, but that is how the Dreyse Zündnadelgewehr might have led to the U.S. Army's current day approach to command and control. So I am Brett from papercartridges.com, a third-rate pseudo expert, and I will see you next time.